we don't all learn in the same ways, at the same paces, and so forth. And some of us learn slowly when a concept comes along. Some of us learn much more rapidly when a concept comes on board. We have different working memory capacities, that is literally the amount of information we can absorb. And we have different long-term memories, different background experiences that informs our learning and makes it more or less likely that we'll actually learn something. And because of this, if we want to maximize every student's potential, this ability to personalize learning is absolutely critical. The definition that we have for blended learning is here's the complicated one, and then I'll boil it down. It's basically a formal education program in which a student is learning at least through online learning, where they have some element of student control over the time, the place, the path, and/or the pace of learning. Those are 4 critical pieces of it. The second part is at least in part in a supervised brick and mortar location, generally a school with a teacher. And the third part of blended learning is that the modalities along each student's path are connected. That is, that students have an integrated learning experience. So what they're learning in, say, small group instruction is not totally divorced from what they're doing in online learning, is not totally divorced from the project that they might do. That is, data connects those different experiences in essence. So to boil it down, and I should be clear with higher ed in the room here, this is a K-12 blended learning definition. It's different for higher education. But it's basically online learning in brick and mortar schools where students have some control over those elements of instruction and their different modalities are connected. That's basically what blended learning is. And importantly, that rules out a few things. What blended learning is not is simply putting an electronic whiteboard in the front of a classroom and beaming online curriculum at students like I'm doing right now. While many people have invested lots in smart boards over the last many years in K-12 classrooms, fundamentally this doesn't change the actual pedagogy of learning itself. It doesn't give students that element of control over the time, place, path, and pace of learning. And so it's not blended. The other thing that we're not talking about here is simply putting in one-to-one laptops or digital textbooks. Those aren't necessarily blended learning either. While those may be important enablers of blended learning, just simply having the technology for technology's sake doesn't mean we've actually made this shift in the model of learning. And it's the model that's way more important than the technology itself. If I can leave you with nothing else today from the competency-based learning discussion and this blended learning discussion, is that the model is what's really critical. And what we're trying to do is shift from a model in which we're teaching an entire classroom to a model in which we're reaching each individual student wherever they may be. Now, like I said, these things may be important enablers to blended learning, but just because you have them doesn't mean you're doing it. You really have to have that shift to that student element of control and so forth. And so there's a bunch of benefits of blended learning, which I've highlighted here, from the ability to individualize or personalize, the ability to boost teacher effectiveness, the ability to get far more robust data and feedback for students, and in some cases, the ability to have cost control or productivity gains. But what we're seeing across the country is that blended learning looks different in different places. There's lots of different models of blended learning, and so a lot of the work we've been doing at the Christensen Institute is trying to define and categorize what these are, because as Sajid knows, a few years ago there was a big discussion where you'd get a couple schools in a room that were clearly doing blended learning, and they would sit there having these arguments about, I'm blended learning and you're not. And it was just this ridiculous conversation. And so what we tried to do is say, you're all blended learning, but you're doing it differently. So Sajid in his work has one model of blended learning. Actually, you have a couple models in your work. And others have other ones. What we've given is a taxonomy here that's pretty confusing in this chart. And so I'll just sort of break it down for you, which is the yellow highlights things that aren't blended learning. But what I want you to think through is that basically we see brick and mortar schools meet online learning, and they have a baby, which is called blended learning. And that's that middle one there. And then within blended learning, we're seeing 4 different broad models pop up across the landscape right now. From the rotation model, to the flex model, to the what we're calling the a la carte model, and finally to an enriched virtual model. Now, I'll sort of explain these, but in the rotation model, what we're seeing is that students are rotating between different modalities at fixed points in time. That's within a given course or subject. So within a math class, for example, in a station rotation model, which occurs within a given classroom, students are rotating from, say, individualized online instruction from one station. Maybe 30 minutes later, they move to small group teacher-led instruction, and then 30 minutes after that, they move to some collaborative activities and stations. This looks very similar to what elementary schools look like and already today. So my sense is that elementary schools are going to move rather rapidly in this direction by just simply adding a station that's online learning to what they're already doing. And for many classroom teachers, this will be an easy way for them to get in the game. Now, a second model that I actually didn't include in the slide deck is called the lab rotation, and it's very similar to the station rotation. The difference is that rather than rotating within the classroom, students are just rotating to what effectively is a computer lab to do these sorts of activities. Now that's a little bit harder for an individual classroom teacher to do by themselves, but in coordination with the school principal, this is something that they can relatively easily do. A third model, also in the rotation category, is the flipped classroom. If you're like me, you're a little bit tired of this phrase at this point because it's gotten a lot of attention, and I've written about that a few times. But the classroom is, in essence, I think of as the low-hanging fruit for K-12 education to get involved in blended learning. You allow students to do lectures or the instruction at home online, and when they come in the classroom, that's when they really get to apply their learning in rich ways with the teacher. And again, this is a model that any teacher across the country could do tomorrow without any permission whatsoever, which is what's so powerful about it. Now, as we start pushing the envelope a little bit, we get into these other models, and the individual rotation is one of these. How many people have heard of Carpe Diem schools? So a handful of people. It's originally based out of Yuma, Arizona. Now they have schools in Indianapolis and are expanding to Ohio next year and trying to move across the country over time. They have what's called an individual rotation model. Students are still rotating between different modalities at fixed points in time, but instead of rotating to every single different activity, students in effect have an individualized playlist. So if a student needs to spend a double period on online learning, then they do that. If they need to spend more time in intervention with a teacher, then they do that. What happens when you walk in Carpe Diem is they have this huge learning lab with about 250 students in it, each who has their own office, in effect. And they decorate their office based on what they want to be when they grow up. Now, one student, when they came in, they said, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" And he said, "I want to be a Walmart greeter." Yeah. So they said, okay. Well, so what they did was then they brought him to Walmart and said, what are the skills that this person's actually doing that gets you excited? So maybe we can open up a whole bunch of careers that you never knew might be before that involved those sorts of skills, which actually was a pretty empowering thing, and his vision for himself changed a little bit. But they do their online learning at their offices, and then they have basically breakout rooms around the perimeter of the learning lab where they can break out into these glass sort of breakout rooms like you'd see in any office, where they can do work with teachers in a variety of different settings. The flex model, which is a wholly different category, is very similar to actually the individual rotation. The difference is that students are just moving between these different modalities in a flexible, fluid fashion. So it's not based on a clock that says every 35 minutes you rotate. It's just if I need to just bounce out and spend some time at the cyber cafe working with some peers on a project for a certain subject, then we do that based on my individual needs. And so it's highly personalized as a result of that. The a la carte model is what many people here are probably familiar with the Georgia Virtual School, where students are taking 1, 2, 3, 4 classes online, and then the rest of their learning tends to be in the traditional brick and mortar environment. It's very similar in some ways to the flex model. The difference is that the teacher of record is actually virtual, though, from the students, so is actually online, whereas in the flex model, the teacher of record is actually face-to-face with the student. These sorts of models get much more involved, such that you tend to need the superintendent or the principal to be actually the one implementing these sorts of things. And what we're seeing from a policy perspective, Georgia passed the clearinghouse bill last year that Senator Chip Rogers led to create those options for many more students across the state. and Louisiana and Utah and others have done big measures with course choice. What we're seeing is that the policy environment can actually enable this to make it a far more affordable option more readily for many more students across the state in some pretty important ways. The last model that we're seeing occur across the country is what we call the Enriched Virtual model. And what we're seeing is that for some students, full-time virtual school, while it's an important option to have, it doesn't quite work for them for any number of reasons, and they actually need a physical touch point in many ways. And so having the ability to go into a school 1, 2, 3 days a week where they can work with a teacher and maybe some peers is a critical piece of the equation. And my personal sense is that actually as the full-time virtual schools continue to grow across this country, they're going to move more and more toward these blended models over time so that they can effectively serve more and more students. Because my sense is that full-time virtual is an important option for many, but it won't work for the majority in the way it's currently constructed.